Thank you, Mr. Huffer. Closing the debate, we have Christian Owen. Christian Owen is a postgraduate student at Trinity College. He won the right to speak through open audition. Mr. Owen, you have the ears of the House.
Okay, to begin, I'd like to address, to be honest, one of the most egregious and absurd things I ever heard on the floor of this House, which is that the third opposition speaker said a moment ago, I quote directly, "No Palestinian wants to annihilate any Jew." It should be obvious to everyone in this room why that statement is completely absurd. But in case it's not, I'm going to quickly tell you guys a quote from Yasser Arafat, a man who won the Nobel Peace Prize for his willingness to negotiate with Jewish people, for his willingness to come to the negotiating table to work with Jewish people. And nonetheless, he made such very difficult to retract statements in his life as, "I have no use for Jews, they are and remain Jews." And, quote, "Peace for us means the destruction of Israel." There is this very sort of unpleasant attitude on certain elements, extreme fringe elements, I agree, of the Palestinian people, and we must confront that. Nevertheless, what I would like to do here is, one of the abstention speakers expressed a desire to hear a little more nuance and a little more acknowledgement that there is blame on both sides. And hopefully that's what I'm going to do here, because out of all the people I've heard today, I would actually say I agree most of all with the second proposition speaker. I agree that the majority of the Israeli people and the majority of the Palestinian people do not want war, that coexistence is possible, that these peoples living side by side is a serious objective that could actually exist. Where I disagree with the second proposition speaker is the specific idea of land for peace, which I think is the wrong way of achieving peace in Israel. So I want to, no thank you. I want to clarify that I'm not defending every policy of the State of Israel. I'm not saying Netanyahu has got everything right. I'm not excusing things like evictions in East Jerusalem. I'm not excusing the blockade of Gaza. I'm going to actually circle back to some of these things later in my speech to offer a potential roadmap for what peace could look like. What I am saying is that the whole idea of land for peace is a failed policy, a peacemaking strategy that has been tried and has been found wanting. So, let's first examine a little bit about what land for peace means. In short, as usually defined, it means that Israel should go back to the 1967 borders, the last borders agreed upon by international law, and give up the territories that it gained in the Six-Day War in 1967. So these would involve dismantling the Israeli settlements in these territories, dismantling around the 130 settlements in the West Bank, the 12 in East Jerusalem, the more than 30 in the Golan Heights. A rigid adherence to land for peace as a mantra would mean dismantling all of these settlements, some of which are now... yeah, go on.
I don't think that actually land for peace does have to involve the eviction of Israeli settlers. I want to see Israeli settlers turn into Palestinian citizens in a Palestinian state. Israel has 20% Palestinian population. I don't see why Palestine couldn't have a Jewish minority.
Sure, I'll come back to that point later in my speech. I will address you. To continue, many of these settlements are now very large. For instance, the city of Modi Ilnitz, which has a population of over 80,000. Now, on what grounds is there the idea that these settlements should be given up, that these territories should be given up back to the Palestinian state? The usual ground is UN Security Council Resolution 242, which called for the withdrawal of Israeli forces, giving up land and the termination of all claims or states of belligerency and the right to live in peace. Now, Palestinians and their supporters have long claimed that this resolution demands Israel relinquish all territory it gained in the 1967 war. Briefly, I'm going to kind of counter the idea that this is occupation in quite the classical sense. Because what happened in here, it is very controversial in the 1967 war who fired the first shot. I agree that is extremely controversial and an issue that historians continue to debate to the present day. What there is no debate about at all is that Gamal Abdel Nasser had massed huge numbers of troops on the border of Israel in a potential invasion before the Six-Day War began. So when you say that this is an occupation, these territories were indeed occupied, but they were occupied in the direct aftermath of an existential threat to Israel's existence. No, thank you. I'd like to make some progress. So Palestinians have claimed that this resolution demands Israel relinquish all territory it gained. This is a misreading, in my view. The authors of that resolution themselves specifically stated they never intended Israel to cede all territories gained in that, in some ways, quite defensive war. Those such as Lord Carradine, who wrote the final draft, said that the words secure and recognised boundaries in it were very carefully chosen, that there was an acknowledgement that the final settlement might not be equivalent to the 1967 settlement. There was going to have to be give and take on both sides. Now, I agree that this situation would be easier to resolve if there weren't any settlements. I don't support further settlement expansion. I think the whole crisis would be easier to sort out if the settlements didn't exist. But they do exist. That's a fact. And there's nothing we can now do about it. Dismantling settlements like Ariel, like Beitar Illit, like Modin Illit, would mean the displacement of tens of thousands, possibly hundreds of thousands of people. And we need a better solution. International law simply has to be flexible to some extent in this situation, because it's better to consider what the situation is rather than some abstract notion of what the situation should be. There comes a point at which it's useless to play games of right and wrong and analyse who has the moral right to a particular territory, because in a dispute that has carried on for so long, there is clearly right and wrong on both sides. What is true is that the people who represent the Palestinian authorities, people like Hamas, people like Hezbollah, will not be happy unless Israeli presence is extirpated from these areas. And we heard from the second proposition speaker how Israeli settlers in these settlements lived in fear. They had to go around with armed escorts, etc. Do we really think that if these settlements were given back to Palestine, A, that there would not be massive reprisals against Jewish settlers in these areas, and B, that if these reprisals took place, that some sort of population movement of these settlers back to Israel could happen without massive violence? Because I don't think it could. Have there not been enough forced population movements in the Middle East without inventing more? Because a transition of jurisdiction is simply, in practice, very likely to lead to forced population movements. And that is likely to lead to casualties. Can you square that with your conscience? Yeah, go on.
Yeah. You really say, we went in, took this land, all these settlers there, whoops, it's too late, can't get out, you got to deal with it. Really? Are you really saying we're not going to have it's too late? Really?
Well, history is a matter of tit-for-tat retaliations of different peoples against different peoples. We all know that that is true. There is a sense in which, should Britain withdraw from Wales because it happened to have conquered it 700 years ago? Ultimately, the right of a particular people to govern a particular area is a case of whether they have exerted a claim and have people living in that area in a sustained period of time. And many of these Israeli settlements are sustained communities that have now existed 30, 40, 50 years and have populations of 50, 60, 70, 80,000 people. We cannot play these games of who has, in theory, the right to a particular territory. We have to consider the rights of the people who actually live there and which jurisdiction they would be safest under. And that is my point. Now, I'm sorry, I need to make some progress. I'm going to move on to a brief defense of the State of Israel in general, even though I do think that the State of Israel has committed terrible things and has failed in certain ways. If the acquisition of land by Israel was really the obstacle to peace, then there would have been peace between Israel and its neighbours prior to 1967, before Israel began winning territory over the 1949 armistice lines. But there was not. I've already said Gamal Abdel Nasser was massing troops on the borders of Israel for a proposed invasion in 1967. Whoever fired the first shot, Israel was seriously in danger. It was not Israel's new possession of the West Bank after that conflict that created the conflict we've seen. It was the refusal to accept Israel's existence from day one by its neighbours that has fundamentally fueled this conflict. And from every territory, I think my fellow speakers have pointed this out very clearly. From every territory that Israel has relinquished unilaterally, particularly in Gaza, terrorists have used these territories as a base of operations to attack Israel. Israel has its faults as a state. Nevertheless, it is one of only 2 countries in the entire Middle East recognized by the Democracy Index as functioning democracies, the other being Tunisia. Israel features very highly on global rankings of human development, income equality, civil rights, etc. In every single one of the countries bordering Israel, being gay is either actively illegal, or in countries where it is officially legal, such as Jordan, spurious public statutes regulating public morality are nonetheless used to make LGBT people's lives very difficult. Life as an Israeli Arab, on the other hand, I will admit, is very far from perfect. There is discrimination. Nearly all Arab towns and cities do have lower standards of living than those that are predominantly Jewish. But it's possible to overstate that situation too. Israeli Arabs have the vote, they have the full constitutional protections of other Israeli citizens, they have the right to protest the government's actions, which empirically they are very much allowed to use, and political parties representing specifically Arab interests hold 10 seats in the Israeli parliament and until last year were part of the government coalition. These are simply facts. They're not there, and these are not things that you can rely on in any of Israel's neighbours. You cannot vote for your government in any of their neighbours. So, to bring things to a close, there are things that I think the Israeli government could do to achieve peace. And the main one of those is reevaluate its policies towards the Gaza Strip. It is an illusion, in my view, that a hard line and the promise of violence is the only answer to threats, because the truly strong and courageous man sometimes knows that it's time to exercise restraint. Israel's supporters, and I address this in some ways to my own side, should ask themselves this simple question: what do the leaders of terrorist groups like Hamas hope to achieve by firing rockets at Israel? The answer, quite obviously, is that they wish to provoke Israel into just this sort of futile, self-damaging retaliation that it frequently engages in, and that, as people in the audience have pointed out, has resulted in pictures of dead Palestinians, dead Palestinian women and children on the newspapers. It is not surprising that this poisons some people's minds against the Israeli state, and I believe that the bombing of densely populated areas is certain to cause the deaths of many innocents. If you shell a very densely populated area like Gaza, you will cause casualties, and sure, not only is this immoral, but the real problem, persuading Arab states and peoples to accept that Israel truly does have a right to exist, will not be solved by that either. So my concluding remarks: if Israel dismantled all settlements tomorrow, evicted the residents of Ariel, Modi'in Illit, or the Golan Heights, or, say, gave them up to control of a Palestinian authority where they may be treated as second-class citizens, and went back to a rigid adherence to the 1967 borders, do you really think Hamas and Hezbollah would give up their campaign of violence against the Israeli state? Or do you think they would find something new to complain about? I think the answer to that question is obvious, seeing that Hamas and Hezbollah openly proclaim that they would continue that conflict until there is no more Israel. And it puts the lie to the idea that land for peace is a stepping stone to a long-term peaceful solution in the Middle East. In its place, I propose a policy of peace for peace, mutual good faith bilateral agreements and concessions made by both sides, which might involve Israel cautiously lifting blockades and showing restraint where it would be easier to use force. It might even involve the exchange of some land in order to make national borders correspond more closely with lived reality on the ground. But what it does not involve is land for peace in the way that it's normally meant. Going back to the 67 borders would not magically solve anything, and it would create problems of its own. We can do better than that. We can do better for the residents of these disputed territories. We can do better for Israel. And frankly, we can do better for Palestine. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Owen, and thank you to all our speakers today. Tomorrow we have welfare from 12 p.m. to 2 p.m. Please come if you would like to discuss any issues concerning the union. That will be taking place in the Kennedy Room. In this house, we vote by our feet. If you're in favour of the motion, please go down the aye door. If you're against the motion, please go down the nose. And if you're unsure, please walk through the middle. Results will be announced in the bar. I look forward to seeing you all there.